my name is Quinn Sorenson. I'm a postdoc in the Latimer lab and the Safford lab at UC Davis. And today I'm going to be talking about where and when to plant trees after fire in the face of water limitation and shrub competition. So first off, let's set the stage. My project was conducted in the yellow pine mixed conifer forests of the Sierra Nevada. And that is a wide range, but you can see in these 4 panels, generally what this forest looks like. It has large trees that are widely spaced. There's not too much of a mid-story, and it's characterized by having an herbaceous and shrubby understory. And it runs north and south through the Sierra Nevada. On the left, you can see the range from Bakersfield up to Redding. And then if you look on the right, you can see how these forests have changed in the last 100 years. So the blue in this region signifies a change in fire return interval. So what that means is that these forests are burning a lot less frequently than they have historically. They used to burn about every 7 to 11 years, and now they're burning about 20 to 50 years, or every 20 to 50 years. And that might be surprising because we hear a lot about California burning in the news, especially this year. But there's other changes to the fire regime that are important. And so what also has changed is the amount of area that's burned in high severity. So this figure, we look in the brown square, these figures show how the yellow pine mixed conifer has changed from the current day compared to reference. We can see that low severity fire has dramatically decreased, whereas high severity fires have increased quite a bit. And fire severity just describes the percent of trees that have died during a fire. So a high mortality or a high severity fire leads to forests and burns with few living trees remaining. This is probably because of the change in the fire return interval, where because fires are much more infrequent, that gives surface fuels a time to develop and increase. And it also increases the amount of ladder fuels, which is like trees or shrubs in the mid-story that can bring fire into the canopy. So when an ignition does spark, it has plenty of fuel on the surface and has a clear path into the canopy to fuel high severity fires. This is important because high severity fires are dramatic differences in the landscape, and they are changing the way that we receive ecosystem services and how we live in these areas. So these changes result in communities that directly are impacted by high severity fires and the changes that fire suppression has caused. And that's not the only change to the fire regime. We also see that the average size of fires has dramatically increased. So historically, fires were relatively small, about 200 acres, and now the average fire size is 7 times larger, with a few outliers of extremely large fires. This is important because historically, these forests regenerated through short distance dispersal. So here what we see is a low severity fire, and there's plenty of living adult trees that remained, and they're making cones and raining seed onto the burned areas so that the forest can recover. And this is an important process because the conifer trees that dominate the system, they don't typically survive in the soil or the seed bank. They require new seeds to disperse to a site for a tree to establish. So in large fires where most of the living trees are burned and there are few trees on the fire perimeter because the fire is so large, we can have type conversions where there was once a forest, but because there's very little seed input, the forest doesn't regenerate and the land is type converted to a shrub field in the most extreme cases. But we can combat this forest regeneration failure by a simple tool we use of tree planting. So in some places we recognize this problem and plant trees to try to help the forest regenerate. And biologically, tree planting can help bypass a few processes. So if you imagine what's required for a tree seedling to establish, first the seed needs to enter the area or land in a microsite. Then it has to have good conditions to grow a tiny root, a tiny stem, and few leaves and survive. And as the tree seedlings progress, perhaps it's more resilient to stress. So you can imagine that these smaller seedlings, they can't withstand more stressful environments, whereas the larger seedlings, which would be representative of what we're planting, might be more resilient to stress. And on the flip side, we can think of this as just the sensitivity to the environment that these tree seedlings there are. So by planting, we can bypass these kind of more delicate, more sensitive stages, and hopefully give trees more of a chance to develop. So my main objective, or our main objective, was to understand where should we plant trees. And that's given the limited resources to actually plant trees as a management action, variation in transplant survival. So sometimes in some places they're just going to be too stressful for plants to survive, even when they're planted. And then there's variation in natural regeneration. We don't want to waste our planting efforts in places that are going to regenerate naturally, where they don't need tree planting. So ultimately, my question today is, can we use environmental variation to predict where trees or tree planting is needed and will increase tree density the most? So to do that, we established a study across 5 fires in the Sierra Nevada. We conducted it in the Cottonwood Fire, the American River Fire, the Moonlight Antelope Fire, Piute Fire, and the Power Fire, as you can see here. And within each of these, we measured seedling density only in high severity patches. And to do this, we paired plots along a planted and unplanted boundary. And these boundaries were not environmentally significant. They were arbitrary boundaries that were mostly due to like funding limitations or just access. And then each plot was 11 meters in diameter. They spanned a wide range of environmental variation. There's about 15 to 25 pairs per site. And then they were sampled 7 to 11 years after planting, so that the trees that were surviving were likely going to persist into the future. And then lastly, planting occurred roughly 1 to 3 years after a fire. And so to understand forest regeneration, we looked at seedling density in these plots, and we tried to figure out all the environmental variation and that we think would affect seedling mortality and thereby seedling density. And we categorize it into 4 different domains. So dispersal will affect seedling density, climate, competition, and microsite conditions. And so for dispersal, or we think those each of them are likely affecting seedling density, and we want to test which ones actually were in our study. For dispersal, we measured distance to the nearest seed source, climate, normal annual precipitation, temperature, solar radiation. Competition, we measured shrub cover, and I must emphasize that shrub cover here is at the time of sampling, not the time of planting, and so it really is more of a proxy for shrub productivity or perhaps overall plant productivity in that site. And then for microsite conditions, we measured litter and depth, topography, elevation, and slope. And so all of these things can impact seedling density. And we wanted to measure that, but we also wanted to understand how planting changes the relationship and perhaps interacts with these factors. And so we tested these factors in a model, and we let them interact with planting. And so I'm just going to review really quickly how to interpret interactions in this case. So you can imagine there's just a gradient. Perhaps it's like one that represents water stress on the x-axis, and then seedling density is our response, and that's our measure of regeneration success. You could expect that seedling density increases with this gradient from more stressful to less stressful. And you might expect that, you know, in one scenario, you could think that by planting, you just increase seedling density across the whole gradient. And so these two lines are parallel to each other because they're responding the same way, but planting just gives the same boost everywhere. But if there's an interaction in the model, you might see something that looks more like this, where at one end of the gradient, the stressful end, planting provides a significant boost in seedling density, whereas perhaps on the unstressful end, it's not actually adding too many more individuals to the area. So we're trying to understand this because in a practical sense, on the left side, that's where on the more stressful side, if you had this result, we would want to focus our planting efforts there and not in the area where planting doesn't actually increase tree density. Okay, so we throw those into the model or into a model, and we did model selection. We asked whether they affected seedling density, whether that interacted with planting, and then in some cases we thought of biological reasons to interact environmental variation together. And so factors came out for each of these 4 domains, and for climate, annual average minimum temperature interacted with normal annual precipitation to affect seedling density. And then for competition, shrub cover, which is really, again, much more like shrub productivity, interacted with whether it was planted or not. And interestingly, which year after planting, or how many years after the fire it was planted. And we'll get to all of these later with some figures, but I just wanted to give you the whole model. And then dispersal came out as important with the distance from a seed source. And then the microsite was important with litter and duff depth, and then an interaction between elevation and topography. And so for climate, there's the interaction between minimum temperature and precipitation. And so on the x-axis, I have the yearly average minimum temperature, and then I have 3 panels that represent dry, moderate, and wet for this region precipitation. And so you can see is that there's an interaction that shows that seedling density is greatest in the dry areas when the temperature is cooler. And then as you move into wetter areas, seedling density increases with temperature. And this probably underlies a water stress gradient. So in the dry areas, hotter temperature drives demand for water, and those seedlings are dying when they're dry and hot. Whereas as water becomes more available, higher temperatures lead to greater rates of photosynthesis, and likely growth, and probably survival. What's interesting to note is that this doesn't interact with planting, which suggests that in any of these hot, dry, cool, wet places, you can have the same boost in seedling density that you see in any other place. So any place along this gradient is a fine place to plant and not waste your efforts. And you might want to plant in the places where natural regeneration is not successful. What's interesting is shrub cover had a 3-way interaction. And so here on the x-axis is percent shrub cover, And that, again, is really just shrub productivity. It's not the cover at the time of planting. And if you look at the areas that are unplanted, there's a decrease in seedling density as shrub productivity increases. And this is likely due to competition. The more productive an area is for shrubs, the more competition there is, and the more seedlings aren't making it. And that's seen across the board in places in all of the places that were planted. But if you look at the places that were planted in the first year after fire, you see a huge increase in seedling density in the places with the highest shrub productivity. They're planted 2 years, that trend is dampened, but you still see an increase in seedling density in high shrub productivity areas where natural regeneration is still low. But then in year 3, that pattern has ended, but there's a reversal where in the low shrub productivity areas, planting increases tree density now, whereas in the first year it didn't. So what's going on here? So we think that this has to do with getting a head start in productive places. So in those areas where shrub cover is high, those are likely places that are lower stress and have more resources and support higher rates of growth. And so shrubs can likely grow quicker and overtop trees and suppress their growth in those areas. But if you get in there quick, you plant trees, those trees can get just enough of a head start to take advantage of those high resources and overtop the shrubs. And that can occur most in the first year, but also in the second or 2 years after fire. But what's interesting is in the third year, I think that you've missed the boat, that you don't give it enough of a head start by planting there. But it might be that in the places where shrub productivity is low, those are likely stressful sites, and areas where tree seedlings might be facilitated by planting a few years after a fire, because it gives time for shrubs to grow and perhaps shield them from wind and transpirational costs, and perhaps provide a little shade if it's a hot day. So I think that this gives a roadmap to thinking about when and where to plant trees if you're worried about competition. For dispersal, there was generally a decrease in seedling density with a distance to a seed source, which makes a lot of sense. This is clearly shown in the literature. Surprisingly, it didn't interact with planting, which seems to suggest that that these areas are dispersal limited, even if they are close to a seed source. It's just not as much as further. And then for the microsite conditions, we see that there's an increase in seedling density with litter and duff. And this one's a little more nebulous, because it could be that litter and duff increase and they provide some buffering of the soil from drying out, and so they might be moisture. But it could also just be correlated with a more productive site that supports seedling density, but also supports high leaf litter inputs. And then there was an interaction with topography and elevation that was interesting. So at low elevations, well, the x-axis of this is topographic position index, which is just, you can think of like the left side, the negative side being more in a valley, and the right side being more on a ridge. And so at lower elevations, the trees do better in closer to a ridge. As you increase in elevation, this flips, and at the highest elevations, trees do much better in valleys than on ridges. And I think this is a trade-off between perhaps competition and stress, where at the lower elevations, there's more water, there's more shade in those valleys. And so maybe they're more competitive and trees are doing better closer to a ridge away from competition, whereas you increase elevation, probably fewer plants competing for resources, and those high resource, high productive environments are supporting greater shrub survival. And so my conclusions are, well, one, that seedling density is controlled by many environmental factors and interact. And this sounds kind of funny because it's kind of a duh, but I think in the literature, there's a lot of motivation to try to pick one thing that's like a silver bullet. But our study suggests that there are very many things that control seedling density, and we really have to be willing to grapple with each of them and unpack each of them to understand how to promote forest regeneration. And then also that these interactions, they seem to underlie water availability and stress and competition for resources. So there's this pull between having enough resources to grow, but also not having so many resources that competition is too fierce for trees to survive. And then next, trees can successfully compete with shrubs, but that hinges on the pace of establishment. So if shrubs are establishing a lot more quickly than trees, they're likely being outcompeted and not able to regenerate. And so my recommendations are that planting should occur during the first year after fire in places where shrub productivity is going to be high, maybe overall productivity is high. And on the flip side, planting can benefit by waiting a few years and more stressful sites. Also, tree growth, trees grow best with water, which is a little unsurprising. But what's interesting is that planting can be successful regardless of temperature and precipitation. And I think that planting success needs just more monitoring and across more fires so that we can understand better the nuances of seedling establishment and try to perfect our ability to predict where to plant trees. Because we use a lot of data, but there's a lot of interacting and multiple factors that determine seedling density, which demands a model a high amount of data in order to be confident. And when we feel confident with our results, it would be better to have 10 times more data. I think everybody always thinks that. So with that, I'd like to thank the Latimer Lab, the Joint Fire Science Program for funding this project, and the Safford Lab. Thank you.